Welcome back to the Time Vault Chronicles. I'm Ron.
And I'm Lily.
Today, we're going to be looking at the conflict between Iran and Israel.
Yeah, it's been pretty much all over the news lately,
Right.
missile strikes and political back and forth. But
Yeah.
what's the real story? What's
Yeah.
actually going on beneath the surface?
Right, and that's what we're here to find out.
Exactly. We've got a ton of great sources to dig into here, so you can really get a handle on what's driving this rivalry that's been going on for decades.
Okay, so let's take a step back for a minute. A lot of people might not realize that Iran and Israel were actually allies at one point before the Iranian Revolution in 1979.
Right.
So what changed?
Well, it was a really dramatic shift. I mean, under the Shah, Iran had a very close relationship with Israel. They were cooperating on all sorts of things like security and trade. But then the revolution in 79 completely changed everything. Iran went from being this monarchy, closely aligned with the West, to an Islamic republic that was openly hostile towards Israel.
So almost like overnight, they went from allies to enemies.
Yeah, basically, it's amazing how one event can completely reshape the whole geopolitical landscape.
Absolutely.
And, in this case, the ideological differences between a Shia Islamic republic and a predominantly Jewish state are really at the heart of the conflict.
So it's like two totally different worldviews clashing.
Exactly.
But there's more to it than just religion, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we also have to factor in the Palestinian question here.
Oh, absolutely. Iran's support for Palestinian groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, which Israel considers terrorist organizations, by the way, is a huge sticking point.
So essentially, Iran is backing groups that are directly opposed to Israel, which obviously just ramps up the conflict.
Yeah, exactly. Iran sees those groups as resistance movements fighting for Palestinian liberation. And their support goes beyond just words. They're providing financial aid, military training, even weapons.
Wow. I could see how that would be seen as pretty provocative from Israel's perspective.
For sure, it definitely adds fuel to the fire.
Yeah.
And this whole rivalry goes beyond just the Palestinian issue, too. It's also a power struggle. Both Iran and Israel want to be the dominant force in the Middle East.
So it's like this high-stakes chess match where every move has these real-world consequences.
Exactly.
Can you give us some concrete examples of how this plays out?
Sure. Well, look at Syria and Yemen, for example. Iran supports the Assad regime in Syria and the Houthi rebels in Yemen, while Israel is actively trying to counter Iran's influence in those countries.
Right.
So what you have are these local conflicts that basically turn into proxy wars, with each side backing opposing factions.
So this conflict isn't just confined to Iran and Israel. It's spilling over into these other countries and making things even more complicated and volatile.
Exactly. It's creating all these ripple effects across the entire region, turning local disputes into international crises. And that brings us to another huge factor, the whole nuclear threat.
Right. The elephant in the room, Iran's nuclear program, and Israel's deep fear of a nuclear-armed Iran.
Exactly.
So how does this issue play into the overall conflict?
Well, it adds this whole other layer of existential threat. I mean, Israel sees a nuclear-armed Iran as a direct threat to their very survival.
I can understand why they would be concerned.
They believe that Iran could actually use nuclear weapons against them, or that it might embolden their allies to act more aggressively, knowing that they have a nuclear power backing them up.
So the stakes are incredibly high.
They are.
Yeah.
And, this fear is not helped by the rhetoric coming from some Iranian leaders who've made statements about wiping Israel off the map.
Right.
And while Iran claims that their nuclear program is purely for peaceful purposes, the lack of transparency and, some of their past activities have created a lot of mistrust in Israel and the international community.
Okay, so we've laid out some of the historical context, the religious and ideological differences, the power struggles, and the looming threat of nuclear weapons. That's a lot to unpack, but understanding these underlying issues is key to really grasping what's happening in the region right now.
Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
those are the core dynamics driving this conflict, and they've been playing out for decades. But now we need to look at some of the more recent events that have really brought things to a head, the things that are making this such a big story in the news right now. So we're talking about the nuclear threat and how it just brings this whole other level of tension to the conflict.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a major concern. What exactly are some of the fears, and how has Israel actually reacted to this perceived threat?
Well, for Israel, it's not just about Iran having nukes. It's about what that could mean. A direct attack on them, or their enemies feeling emboldened to get more aggressive because they've got a nuclear power backing them up.
So it's kind of like a domino effect, right? One thing leads to another.
Exactly. And that fear just gets amplified even more by some of the things that you hear Iranian leaders saying. Those statements about wiping Israel off the map.
Yeah. I can see why they'd be worried. So what have they done about it? I mean, they haven't just sat back and done nothing, right?
Oh, definitely not. Their response has been pretty proactive. They've applied diplomatic pressure, lobbied the international community to impose sanctions on Iran. And of course, they were incredibly vocal when it came to the Iran nuclear deal. They argued that it didn't do nearly enough to stop Iran from developing nuclear capabilities.
And they pushed really hard for the U.S. to withdraw from that deal, and ultimately that's exactly what happened.
Right, but their actions go beyond just words and diplomacy. Israel has also engaged in what's often called a shadow war against Iran's nuclear program.
Yeah, a shadow war. That sounds pretty intense.
It is. We're talking sabotage, cyber attacks, even targeted assassinations, all of it aimed at slowing down or disrupting Iran's progress towards getting nukes.
Like a high-stakes game of cat and mouse.
Exactly, but with incredibly high stakes. So yeah, it can get pretty interesting.
Can you give us some examples? What kind of things have they actually done?
Well, there was the Stuxnet computer virus, which most people believe was a joint operation between the U.S. and Israel. That caused some serious damage to those Iranian centrifuges they use for enriching uranium. And then you've got all these mysterious explosions and assassinations targeting Iranian nuclear scientists and facilities.
Stuff that never really gets confirmed officially, but that everyone kind of suspects is going on?
Right, those things rarely get acknowledged publicly. But it's widely believed that Israel's behind a lot of them. It's a risky strategy, though. Some people even say it's backfired and actually made Iran even more determined to develop nuclear weapons and push them to operate in even more secrecy.
So really dangerous game with an uncertain outcome.
It's a very volatile situation. It adds a whole other dimension of complexity to this already tense conflict.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot here. The history, the ideology, the fight for regional dominance, those nuclear fears.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to bring this back home a little bit. How does all of this affect India and people listening to us here?
That's a great point.
Yeah.
It's easy to think of this as something that's happening far away and doesn't really affect us. But the reality is that it does impact us all. One of the biggest concerns for India is the potential economic fallout.
I see. Okay, so break that down for us.
Well, think about oil. India is heavily reliant on oil imports, and a lot of that oil comes through the Strait of Hormuz, which is right by Iran. If the flow of oil gets disrupted for any reason, conflict, sanctions, anything like that, the impact on India's economy could be huge.
Right. So we're talking about potential price hikes, maybe even shortages, and that would affect everything from transportation costs to the prices of basic goods.
Exactly. And then there's the Indian diaspora. You've got millions of Indians who live and work in the Gulf region. Their safety becomes a big concern whenever there are these periods of heightened tension like we're seeing now.
We've seen this happen before during other conflicts. India having to evacuate its citizens from dangerous zones. That's a massive logistical challenge, and it costs a ton of money.
Right, and it's something the government always has to be prepared for. And then beyond those immediate concerns, you've got the long-term impact on India's strategic interests, especially when it comes to things like connectivity.
Okay, I'm curious to hear more about that. What are we talking about here?
Well, think about the Chabahar port in Iran. India's invested a lot in that port because it gives them a strategic link to Afghanistan and Central Asia. It's a way for them to bypass Pakistan and establish those alternate trade routes.
So if things keep getting worse in the region, that project could be jeopardized.
Exactly. All that increased tension, the possibility of more sanctions, maybe even military conflict, it all creates a lot of uncertainty. And that makes it a lot harder for India to pursue those strategic goals in the region.
So a really complicated web of interconnected interests. I mean, it sounds like the Iran-Israel conflict affects India on multiple levels, and I imagine the government's watching this whole situation very closely.
They are, absolutely. It's something that requires really careful monitoring and a nuanced understanding of all the different dynamics at play. This is not just some distant conflict happening somewhere else. It has very real consequences for India, both in the short term and the long term.
So we've talked about a lot of the negatives here, the threats, the dangers. But are there any efforts underway to try to find some kind of peaceful solution to this conflict? I mean, it seems incredibly intractable.
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The path to peace is a long and winding one, and there's no easy answer. But there have been attempts, both in the past and more recently, to try to bridge that gap.
I'd be interested to hear about that. What kinds of things have been tried? What's on the table now?
Well, if you look back, one of the most significant efforts was the Oslo Accords, which were signed back in 1993. That was a landmark agreement. It aimed to create a framework for a two-state solution with an independent Palestine existing alongside Israel.
Yeah, it was huge at the time.
Yeah.
It felt like a real attempt to find a peaceful resolution to that Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
It was. But the Oslo Accords, while they were definitely a historic step, haven't completely delivered on that promise of lasting peace. The situation on the ground is still really complex, and the process has stalled in a lot of ways.
So a good idea, but maybe not the perfect solution. Is there anything more recent that gives us some hope?
Well, there are the Abraham Accords, which were signed in 2020. Those were pretty surprising.
How so?
Well, they involved Israel normalizing relations with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain.
Yeah, those took a lot of people by surprise.
Yeah.
Israel making peace with Arab states, that was a pretty big shift in the whole regional landscape.
It was the Abraham Accords, which were brokered by the U.S., were a significant breakthrough. And the hope is that if Israel can normalize relations with more Arab countries, it could help to isolate Iran and reduce their influence in the region.
So kind of an indirect approach,
Yeah.
using diplomacy to try to shift that balance of power.
Right. And it's still early days, but the Abraham Accords do represent a potential path toward a more peaceful and stable Middle East.
Where does India fit into all of this? Is there any role for them to play in these peace initiatives?
Well, India is in a really unique position. They have strong diplomatic relationships with both Israel and a lot of Arab states, including Palestine.
Right.
So it's a delicate balancing act, trying to stay neutral while also advocating for peace.
Yeah, takes a lot of diplomatic finesse.
It does. But India's always supported a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They see that as the most viable way to achieve lasting peace.
And they've also participated in various international efforts to try to address these Middle East issues, right?
Yeah, absolutely. India has always been a consistent voice for dialogue and diplomacy. They've been urging all sides to come to the negotiating table. And with their long-standing commitment to peace and their strong ties to both sides, they could actually play a really important role in any future peace efforts.
So they have the potential to be a bridge builder, a facilitator of dialogue.
Exactly. And there's another development that's worth mentioning, the I2U2 grouping.
Okay, I2U2. What is that? And how does it relate to all of this?
Well, I2U2 stands for India, Israel, the USA, and the UAE.
Oh, wow.
It was formed in 2021, and the focus is on economic cooperation and regional stability. It's not directly aimed at resolving the Iran-Israel conflict, but it does involve some pretty key players in the region.
So the idea is that if you can build economic cooperation and stability, that could eventually spill over into the political realm.
Yeah, that's the hope. Some experts think that building trust and cooperation on more practical matters, things like trade, infrastructure, technology, that it could create a more favorable environment for peace down the road.
So it's more of a long-term strategy, building relationships and fostering cooperation in the hope that it eventually leads to less tension.
Right. And it's still early days for ITU too, but it does represent a potentially promising avenue for regional cooperation and hopefully a step towards a more peaceful future.
So we've got all this complicated history, all this ongoing tension, and then you've got these various efforts being made to try to find some kind of solution. As we're wrapping up this part of our discussion, what are the key takeaways for our listeners? What's the big picture here?
Well, I think one of the most important things to remember is that this conflict isn't just about two countries disagreeing. It's deeply rooted in history, ideology, and the struggle for power. And it affects all of us even here in India.
It's easy to just focus on the headlines, but it's so important to really understand the complexities of what's going on.
Exactly. And another key takeaway is that while things are really serious, peace is still a possibility.
Yeah.
It might seem like a long shot given everything we've talked about, but there are people actively working towards it. And initiatives like the Abraham Accords show that breakthroughs can happen.
So there's still hope.
Yeah.
There's a lot of work to be done, but peace is definitely possible.
Absolutely. It reminds us that diplomacy, dialogue, that willingness to try to find common ground, those are essential tools if we want to achieve peace. And we all have a role to play in promoting those values.
We've been talking about the Iran-Israel conflict kind of from that, high-level view, the history, the politics, all the strategic stuff. But I think sometimes we lose sight of the fact that there are, actual people whose lives are being affected by this.
You're so right. It's easy to get caught up in all the geopolitical maneuvering and forget that there are real people caught in the middle. Their lives are being turned upside down by all this tension and violence.
Yeah. Behind every headline, there are individual stories, families who are just trying to live their lives.
And I think it's important to remember that on both sides of this conflict, there are people who genuinely want peace. They want a future where their kids can grow up without all this fear and hostility.
Right. We tend to hear mostly from the hardliners, the ones who are pushing for more aggressive action. But I'm sure there are many people in both Iran and Israel who just want to be able to live their lives in peace.
Absolutely. And their voices often get drowned out by all the louder, more extreme rhetoric. It's important to remember that they're there, though. These
Yeah.
people who are working so hard to try to find common ground and build bridges.
So it's not just this clash of civilizations like some people make it out to be.
Hmm.
There's a lot of nuance within each country.
Exactly. And within that nuance, there are people who are actively working to try to create more understanding, even with all the tension and mistrust.
That's actually really inspiring to hear that even in a situation as difficult as this, there are people who haven't given up on the idea of peace.
It does give you hope. And it reminds us that we can't just sit back and do nothing. We all have a role to play in building a more peaceful world.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'd like to ask you, what can our listeners do? How can we as individuals contribute to creating a more peaceful future, even when we're talking about a conflict that seems so far away and so intractable?
It's easy to feel helpless, but there are things we can all do. The first is education. Going beyond just the headlines, seeking out different perspectives, really challenging our own biases, trying to understand the complexities of the conflict and not falling into the trap of oversimplifying things.
So, being informed, engaged citizens, not just passively consuming whatever's on the news.
Right. We can also support organizations and initiatives that are working to promote peace and dialogue. There are tons of groups out there on both sides and internationally who are dedicated to this kind of work. You can volunteer, donate, or just help spread the word about what they're doing.
And we can use our own voices too, speaking out against hatred and violence, advocating for peaceful solutions. Even small actions can help to build a culture of peace.
Exactly. It starts with each of us recognizing our shared humanity, even in the midst of conflict. Choosing hope over despair, believing that a better future is actually possible. That's how we create a more peaceful world.
I love that. It reminds us that peace isn't just some abstract idea. It's something that we have to actively build day by day through the choices we make and the actions we take.
Yeah, that's a really powerful thought. And it's something we should all keep in mind, not just when it comes to this conflict, but in all aspects of our lives.
Well, thank you for joining us on this journey into the Time Vault Chronicles. We've explored a really complex and challenging topic, but hopefully you've come away with a better understanding of the Iran-Israel conflict, its history, its complexities, and maybe even some hope for the possibility of peace. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep believing in the power of dialogue and understanding.